Thanks, Sonia. Jimmy, welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. And I know people are really chuffed to be able to talk to you for a second time in the one day. I'm actually going to start with where you left off in the plenary session this morning. So you talked about a whole range of different issues, but you finished with this concern that you have about the future of the open internet. So I wondered whether we could talk about that and what you see as the biggest threats to that movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I think there are a number of different threats to the open internet that range from sort of business developments to regulatory questions to legal things, censorship in particular. And one of the things that I would note as an example, if right now here in this room, and I haven't checked this today, but it's always this way, if you try to visit the website of the newspaper in Decatur, Alabama, a small town near where I grew up, you can't see it from here. And it's blocked because of GDPR. Mm-hmm. So the small town newspaper has decided not to serve traffic from Europe, which we're still in Europe for GDPR purposes, because it claims worldwide jurisdiction and so on and so forth, and it's complicated for them to comply with. And sometimes when I've tweeted this as a complaint, because my mother sends me a news story from Decatur and I can't read it, people say, well, they should stop abusing our data then. And I'm like, if you think Decatur Daily newspaper is abusing your data, you're probably missing the point. And if you think GDPR is stopping Facebook from abusing your data, you're also missing the point. So, and this is, GDPR as a regulation, I don't have a particular problem with it, other than that, clumsily implemented, it could be reformed, it could be refined to not have as big an impact on balkanizing the internet. And of course, I care a lot about this because I'm a Wikipedian, and I need to access sources from all around the world. And if I can't, because of various regulations, that's problematic. That's just one example, and not probably the most critical one, although I think it's quite bad. Actually, I think the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is also not accessible, and that's a big city newspaper. So, even though that may not be the worst one, I think it's a good illustration of a well-meaning regulation which has had some knock-on effects that are not good for openness. So that's the sort of thing that, in general, I'm quite worried about.
Let's follow this sort of notion of the balkanization of the internet. And, I, as a former journalist myself, I have a tendency towards liking to sort of frame dystopian futures. So if that carries on unchecked, where does that take us?
Well, it's not good. I mean, right now, one of the impacts that we are seeing is, I'll just use the very active and live example of the news media in Russia versus the news media everywhere else in the world have a completely different story, completely different narrative. And this leads to people there having beliefs that are not consistent with the facts of reality, which causes them to support sort of things that are clearly bad and damaging. Even good people in Russia probably believe that this is denazification and that it's a small military operation, whatever. That's just bad. And so if we talk about worst case scenarios, one of the fantastic opportunities and exciting things about the internet is just this idea of you can have friends anywhere in the world. You can know other cultures. You can know other people. That we can all see ourselves as human beings on the planet, not as sort of warring tribes. And so to the extent that we have this balkanization, then we live in our own bubbles, then that's bad. Now, let's be clear that the Russian example is only one type of example. We also see, obviously, information bubbles in the West. Certainly, I live in one. I live in London, and if you asked me 2 weeks before the Brexit vote, what was likely to happen, other than the fact that I'd seen some polling data which made me surprised at how close it was. But you really wouldn't, living in London, in my social circles anyway, it was literally exactly 0.0% of people who thought this was a good idea. Clearly, we didn't realize, right? I didn't realize, but probably some people did. So And then in the US, of course, quite famously, there's different narratives, Fox News and so on. So that information bubble problem is a problem everywhere, but it certainly is exacerbated when we also have sort of artificial barriers and walls that people can't get information elsewhere. And one of the things about Wikipedia, in principle, the commitment to neutrality, which is imperfect, of course, and we're human beings and all of that, does hopefully mean like you can come to Wikipedia and hear both sides of a story, and you can understand what different people on different sides are saying, and therefore come to a better decision or better conclusion informed by what people who disagree with you think.
I was actually going to come on to Wikipedia because I was doing a little bit of background reading research over the weekend, and I came across a quote. I can't remember the attribution, which is terrible, but somebody once said that you're the only big tech boss who isn't a billionaire.
About 800 journalists have said that. So,
okay. So I'm the
all very interested.
801st,
they say to me, how does it feel to not be a billionaire? I'm like, how does it feel to you?
So what? Very good point. I'm wondering, what. So the motivations are different. You get your kicks from more than the money. I'm wondering, what that vision and those kicks bring to the free internet that other big tech companies don't. So what is it that you do differently that Wikipedia does differently?
Yeah, so I think a big piece of it is Wikipedia is fundamentally community driven. And so in my plenary, I talked about the feudal model of content moderation versus the open wiki model. And so that brings us to a lot of different places for a lot of different reasons. I think it's been important that Wikipedia is a nonprofit. And I'm not anti-for-profit companies, so don't pigeonhole me there. But for our purposes, I think it's been very important. It means that the Wikimedia Foundation is incredibly mission-driven and isn't primarily revenue-driven, and that's important. Mm-hmm. So, sometimes people say to me, why don't you just put an ad on every page of Wikipedia, because then you would not have to do any fundraising. You could obviously make, so much more money. And it's like, at what moral cost and what cost to our independence? So right now, when you're on Wikipedia, and you're on the page, Las Vegas, right? You can trust the information there is just some geeky Wikipedians who are writing about the history and story of Las Vegas. And it's not, you don't see flashing ads at the top, come to Vegas, cheap tickets, da-da-da-da. Even though I think selling tickets to fly to Las Vegas cheaply is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, I don't think it's right for Wikipedia. And then the next level of that is, at the Wikimedia Foundation, when we're thinking about design of software and things like that, nobody ever suggests, gee, we should try and move the traffic from the site and tempt people over to higher revenue pages, mm-hmm. right? So, gosh, we can't sell anything to these people who are reading about Queen Victoria, but we might be able to sell them cheap tickets to Las Vegas if they could get them to read. That just isn't a thought process. It's an encyclopedia, and follow your heart and follow your mind and so forth. So that being a nonprofit, I think, has been really important, that it aligns our values. But even further, being a nonprofit that is funded by a very wide margin by small donations mm-hmm. is also important. So another thing people say to me is, why are you asking for money on the website? Why don't you just get Google and Apple and Facebook to pay for it? And I'm like, let's think that through a bit, I don't think that sounds like a great idea, because we meaning the community, mm-hmm. Have a really strong intellectual independence. And so, if some donor calls up and says, I'm really unhappy about this page, I would just say, well, I'm sorry. There's not much I can do about that, because it's Wikipedia, and the community is not going to care that you don't like the page about your company. So it means nothing's for sale and all of that.
Just remind us how big that community is.
So the size of the community is, there's no simple answer to that. So millions of people have edited throughout time. Every month, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but it's 70 to 90,000 people a month make at least 5 edits. And then there's, say, 3,000 to 5,000 who are the really active volunteers. These are the ones who, they all know each other and we know them and so on. And so that's 3,000 to 5,000 people making at least 100 edits. So it's very, and then, it's, editing is up this year, which is a good thing. But it's pretty stable. So we had our peak, the highest number of editors was in, I think, 2007. And then it went through a decline, which was quite worrisome because we were like, oh dear, from 2001 to 2007, it was a great ramp upwards. And have we, was it a fad that nobody's going to want to do anymore? But it stabilized, and so it's been, I think it was kind of exciting for people at first, and some people got bored of it, but the geeks kept doing it. So.
Yeah, it's every founder's fear, isn't it? That it was magic, and the magic's coming.
yeah, but no, it's been reasonably stable for a long time, so it's been up a bit in recent years. So yeah, it's a good, healthy community.
But there are threats, and you mentioned some of these in your talk this morning. In fact, and I'm paraphrasing, I think you said that the biggest threat to Wikipedia is misguided regulators with little or no understanding of content moderation on the web.
Yes, that sounds like
that's a huge topic, right? Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing, and I did talk about this extensively this morning, so maybe most people have heard this, but the Wikipedia model is not the top-down, what I call the feudal model of every other system, where the rules are set by the owner, and the enforcement is done by the owner's police, and you as a user, really have very little say in how the site is moderated and what decisions are made, versus the Wikipedia model where the community is completely in charge of all of that and sort of makes the rules and enforces the rules and so on and so forth within certain broad parameters. So one example would be set down from me from day one when I said in POV is non-negotiable, so neutral point of view, non-negotiable, that Wikipedia will be neutral. So you wouldn't have a situation where some language version of Wikipedia decides that it's going to be the Greek Orthodox Church point of view. I just picked that randomly as a church that I don't think would have any desires to do that, but it just won't happen, because that's sort of one of the fundamental rules that the Wikimedia Foundation even would be prepared to say, no, actually, that we're going to shut that down. That's not possible. But in general, all the rules are made by the community. It's it's a very open system, and so if you're thinking, oh, how can we force the companies to do a better job of dealing with trolling? And so you start to impose obligations on companies and legal. I mean, in this country, they're talking about criminal charges against executives of internet companies, and I'm like, hello, I live here. I don't really want to be criminally responsible if somebody's being mean to someone on the internet, even though I think we do a good job, better than almost anybody else, of we don't allow trolling, we don't allow abusive behavior and so forth. We've always said Wikipedia is not a wide open free speech forum. It's a project to build an encyclopedia. So even though we're in a good position, you can imagine us suddenly being in the position of saying, look, yeah, we could be criminally responsible if somebody is bullying someone on the site. Gee, then are we able to let the community do the moderation? Do we have to start really stepping in and controlling what's said on the website in a way that we never have before? It just is unworkable. So that's the sort of thing that I do worry about.
I was going to ask you a question actually about how you and the open web movement were working to educate lawmakers, but I guess it's a two-part. It's what are you doing to educate lawmakers, and what can lawmakers learn from you and the model? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, certainly, there's a lot to be learned, and a lot of the problems are really, really hard. So, something that I used to be sort of more optimistic about, and I'm not as optimistic anymore because I haven't really seen it work, is the idea of using a wiki type of model for government consultations. So right now the typical sort of government consultation is, here's a form, post your comment, and then the government gets like 30,000 comments. Half of them are trolling and half of them are nonsense, and they have to sort through them as best they can. This is not a very useful system. So imagine if you had instead a system where people could come together as groups, thoughtfully negotiate and debate and get different people from different sides and actually build something. I think it's a great idea. I've just not seen it put into practice anywhere very well. And there are a lot of challenges there, because certainly for a lot of political issues, people have a real axe to grind. Sometimes they are lobbyists who have a real axe to grind. It's sort of controlling that process so that you actually are getting a balanced representation of the public who are really thoughtfully chewing on the problems is hard to do. But I think that it's the sort of thing that we should be hoping for and expecting, that we see some idea in government of, using digital tools in a way that to engage the public in new ways and productive ways.
It's really interesting, because I have to confess for my sins that I was a civil servant at one point, working in the Cabinet Office, and one of the projects that I was involved with in 2010 was something called Your Freedom, which was about abolishing redundant laws and regulations, and this was all about crowdsourcing the opinions of the public. And there was a huge amount of discussion going on at the time about how can we use these tools to widen consultation and carry out deliberative engagement at scale. And you're right, it doesn't seem to have actually lived up to what we thought.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Rohan Silva was in number 10. Yeah, there was something they did where they were looking to cut waste in government, and they sort of had a form, fill out, identify waste in government and let us know. And they got oh, well, we had to throw out a bunch of pens because they've been in the cabinet for so long that they went dry. It's like, great, but that's not really, there's 30,000 comments. How do we do anything useful with that? And so it's not as simple as people would have thought.
No.
While at the same time, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking in that way. Yeah. Sort of, how do we engage more minds in a positive, constructive way? Because we know in some ways it definitely is possible. I mean, we see it in open source software projects all the time. We see it in Wikipedia where, there's problems and there's disagreements, but people come together and they sort of chew it and they come to compromise, and it basically works, rough consensus and running code, as the old saying is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to get really specific now, and then I do want to leave some time for questions, because I'm sure that we've got lots of those in the audience. Right. It's not quite an elephant in the room, but it almost is. The online safety bill, dare I say it. The kitchen sink bill, as it's been dubbed, it's been kicking around, I think, since 2018 now, and it's sort of, its boundaries seem to have expanded quite significantly. You, of course, have testified to Parliament or given evidence to Parliamentary Committee on this. I just wonder, why have you, for those who don't know, this is a piece of you going through the UK Parliament at the moment. It has to enter statute, I think, in the autumn of 2023, but it's just had its second reading in the House of Lords. This is something that Jimmy has been, very vocal about, along with a bunch of other people as well, it has to be said. So I just wonder what you think is wrong with it, if we have time to even touch the sides.
I mean, there's a lot of different elements. So fundamentally, for the first step is to say, as you read the bill, if you're thinking about, this is a way to try and get Facebook and Twitter to do a better job, then you understand the bill. Like that is sort of what their thought process is. If you think, how will this impact small community websites? How will this impact Wikipedia? How will it impact this, that, and the other? There's been no thought in the bill really about that sort of thing at all. And so it's deeply flawed in lots of ways. And then, the other thing is it's one of your more classic sort of just think of the children kind of debates, where it's hard to be against it because you don't want to, online safety for children in particular is incredibly important, and I'm very much in favor of it. But I'm not in favor of it in way, attempting it in ways that actually don't make sense. So the sort of age gating requirement, which I think may have been amended in the Lords recently, so I'm not quite clear on where it stands today, so I'll talk hypothetically about it. But Michelle Donnellan, the relevant minister, put out a video reading a really straw man question. Oh dear, are children not going to be allowed to read Wikipedia for their homework? It's like, obviously not. That's not going to happen because the entire country would go into revolt. That's, you can't stop kids from using Wikipedia. But the law, there's nothing, so Michelle assures, this is not going to happen, but, there's nothing in the bill that I can find that would say why we would be exempted from this. And so that's problematic. And then furthermore, it's like, how is that going to work? And so she's asked the question. She says, oh, these tech companies, we're not going to mandate which technology, but they've got lots of ways. Well, we don't have lots of ways. We don't have lots of ways because we don't do the kind of data gathering. So yeah, it's probably true that when you get on your computer, Facebook, everyone in this room, Facebook or any of the major sort of ad-serving companies, they probably got a pretty good idea of a lot of things about you. Your age, your demographic, your income, your interests, and so on, because the system is gathering, surveillance capitalism, as it's been called. And so, you could say, well, they kind of know when it's a kid, so they can okay, first of all, that's very fuzzy and vague anyway. But guess what? Wikipedia deliberately gathers almost no information on anyone. It is part of our principles, and in fact, we think it's an important safety principle that, and a human rights principle. Like, you go on Wikipedia, and what you're reading is your own personal private business. And we don't look into it. We don't care. We store a little bit of data, long enough to do some statistics, and then we burn it. Like, that's our way, because we think that's important. It's the same way a lot of libraries, at least in the US, I don't know about here, are very keen not to keep records on which books people are reading, because that's just dangerous information to have. Even in sort of safe, calm Western democracies, you don't necessarily want people knowing what books you read. Like, that's kind of your own business. So things like that, right, where it's like, has this really been thought through? Is it likely to actually improve anyone's safety? Is it actually addressing the real problems people face? And so we have to concede, if we're having a frank conversation, some of the problems that people are concerned about are real problems, but they are deeper and broader than the internet. So if we want to talk about negative body image issues, particularly for young girls, this is a huge problem in society that leads to a lot of bad outcomes for women, bullying, all this sort of thing. But you know what? We used to be banging on about that with the fashion magazines and things like that. Nobody's complaining about the fashion magazine anymore, even though they're as bad as they've ever been. And so that deeper cultural problem of what are the messages we're giving to teenage girls of what makes you important, what makes you popular, what should you be focused on. If they are around how skinny you are and how you look and what clothes you're wearing, that's negative in society, and we all know it's negative. And now if we want to say, well, it's Instagram's fault. Okay, right, Instagram is not great on this. Certainly, young girls do get on Instagram and they start following influencers who are not healthy and all that. True. But guess what? It's a deeper, more fundamental social problem that I'm not sure what the solution is. I mean, I wish I could tell you, and I know how to solve it. I have no idea how to solve it.
Yeah.
Like, that's a culture problem that we all need to struggle with. So that's, one example. I had another example in mind, but I got on a rant on that one, so maybe I'll just leave it there.
No, don't worry. I mean, it's a great example, and I think one of the things that's been said about the bill is it's there is legislation, and a lot of the areas that it covers, there already is legislation. Yeah. For the offline world.
I know what I was going to say. So, one thing I don't see in the bill is any serious amount of funding for increased police resources to deal with bullying, harassment, stalking. So if you're being stalked or bullied online and you call the police, what is the response you get? Well, not good enough. That is the answer. And so if somebody said, in order to improve online safety, we're adding a whole department of sort of trained counselors and police to look into and to help people with the issue, we're actually going to increase funding to anti-bullying charities so that we can get these messages out there and have helplines for people to call that aren't necessarily calling the police, but calling someone who can give you advice. That sounds great. That sounds like that would contribute a lot to online safety. And we don't see any of that in this bill. And so I'm like, okay, this isn't really fit for purpose. Like, we could do so much better than this without introducing all kind of sort of, I mean, one of the things that I get wound up about is that legal but harmful content is a really bad expression. I think even the proponents have started distancing from that because it's kind of incoherent. It's like, we want regulation so that we can censor content that's legal, but we're not going to say it's illegal anymore. Like, that's just crazy talk, right? It's like, let's be honest and say, we actually think the sharing of certain ideas should be illegal, which nobody wants to say because everyone wants to say they're in favor of freedom of expression, but they want to enact rules that would force internet companies to take down content or suppress it in various ways, even though it's legal, okay, this is like incoherent way of talking. It's a scam, right? It's a way of trying to convince people of something without really saying what it is you're trying to do.
Kind of also the world's worst flowchart, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Is it this? Or I don't know. Okay, I'm going to stop asking questions now to give the audience an opportunity. So I'm expecting lots of hands to go up, maybe wrongly. There's one over there and one over here. So Richard, I think it is, in the glasses, and then Sarah sitting over here. I don't know everybody's name, by the way. Just again. I haven't got all your data and memorised your faces.
Like Emma, I was also a BBC journalist. In fact, Emma was my editor for a while, longer ago than either of us care to remember. But I want to ask, there's so many questions I could ask you, but the one question I really want to ask you is, you used the word neutrality. My former employer uses the word impartiality, and I wondered if you could talk about the difference between neutrality and impartiality and how you decide what neutrality is.
Okay, so I'm not sure what the difference is between neutrality and impartiality. I would say they're quite close synonyms, and I suppose without naming your former employer, we might be talking about the BBC, who I think uses that term. So good question. I'm not really sure how the BBC thinks about it in the nitty-gritty details. Okay. Probably. So from our perspective, the way we would say, so first of all, to keep in mind, that the Wikimedia Foundation, as the owner and operator of Wikipedia, does not get involved in content disputes at that level at all. It just doesn't. So it's really the community that conceives of this and enforces it and thinks about it. And one of the ways that we think about it is we say, part of it is to go meta and to say, what are all of the major points of view on this issue and how do we present them fairly? So, and this is a judgment call. This is really very, very human, and it involves a lot of dialogue and discussion. So the article on the moon doesn't say, the moon, some say is made of rocks, some say cheese, who knows, you know? And that's where I would say the BBC and a lot of news organizations fall down of like, this sort of panel of Harvard scientists says the vaccine is safe and effective, and this Hollywood actress-comedian says it's dangerous. Who knows, that's not really neutrality. That's like just dropping the ball on being thoughtful. At the same time, recognizing there are valid different viewpoints on many, many, many topics. They need to be addressed. They need to be presented fairly. For an encyclopedia, you don't want to come to the encyclopedia and be told only one side of the story if there are legitimate disagreements. So we don't try to always present you with the capital T truth, according to us. We try to present you with the major sides. And so we call it going meta. It's like step back from the debate and present the debate rather than try to answer the question. So, if you think about a particular example that sounds hard, is actually quite easy. A topic like abortion, right? A very controversial topic. People have very passionate views on it. And, if you imagine a kind and thoughtful Catholic priest and a kind and thoughtful Planned Parenthood activist, the important part is kind and thoughtful, and they can come together and they can work on the entry about abortion, knowing we're never going to agree fundamentally. Like, we have very different worldviews about this topic. And so Wikipedia is not going to say, abortion is a sin, but it could say the Catholic Church's position on abortion is this, and the Pope has said this, and critics have responded that. And at the end of the day, hopefully both those people can look at that, point to the article with pride and say, this explains what we're arguing about. Like, this is a fair explanation of the debate. And what we have found is that it turns out that if we specify kind and thoughtful, even highly ideological people, in fact, in some cases, very well-informed ideological people find this easier to do, because if I'm really convinced and I feel confident in my position, I don't mind you hearing the other side's view, because I think if you understand the issue, obviously you'll agree with me. Whereas the people who aren't sure of their position, who just have ideology without facts to back it up, are terrified to hear the other side, and they want to shut it down and silence it. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying there are no easy answers, but I think the idea, almost everybody understands it and gets it and wants it. My favorite example recently, I read this really great article in the Washington Post when Trump was president, and I agreed with it completely, and I thought it was fantastic and fun, but it was not an opinion editorial piece. It was supposed to be straight news, and it was basically just a rant against Donald Trump, which I agreed with fully. But I thought, you know what, this isn't really what I want from straight news. Like, if I want a rant against Donald Trump, I can write my own, or I can go to the opinion editorial page and get a really nice, juicy rant against Donald Trump. This is supposed to be reporting in a straight news kind of way on some scandal of his. And I think it's important that it be as neutral as possible, because otherwise, people who you're trying to persuade and convince that Trump is basically a criminal are going to read this and go, not really buying this, because it's obviously just a rant against Donald Trump, and therefore I don't find it as persuasive as a straight factual article that might, not throw up my defenses and let me kind of think through the information a bit more clearly.
We could carry on this conversation all afternoon, and in some ways I wish that we were going to do that, but we have to be fair to our other panellists and people who've submitted to the CFP. But Jimmy, this has been absolutely fascinating, and on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
For joining us.
Good.
Thank you.